How dare you sit there and pretend to be impartial? You're clearly biased, and frankly, you look quite foolish up there.
In 40 years on this bench, I've seen wealth, I've seen privilege, I've seen entitlement walk through that door more times than I can count. But I've never, and I mean never, seen someone look a 68-year-old retired teacher in the eye and call her just a nobody. Until Ambassador Richard Thornton's daughter walked into my courtroom that Tuesday morning. By the time Victoria Thornton left, she understood exactly what happens when diplomatic privilege meets contempt of court. It started on a Friday night around 10:30 p.m. in a quiet residential neighbourhood near Brown University. Victoria Thornton, 26 years old, daughter of the United States Ambassador to Luxembourg, was driving her Mercedes through a school zone doing 45 miles per hour in a 25 zone. She'd been drinking at some upscale bar downtown. Blood alcohol level later tested at 0.11, well over the legal limit of 0.08. She lost control and crashed straight into a pedestrian crossing sign, completely destroying it. That sign came crashing down and nearly struck Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, a 68-year-old retired elementary school teacher who was crossing the street legally at a marked crosswalk. Mrs. Hayes had just finished her volunteer shift at the public library. She'd taught third grade for 42 years at Hope Street Elementary, dedicated her entire life to educating children, and now in retirement, she was still serving her community. When that sign came crashing down, Mrs. Hayes fell backward trying to avoid the debris and fractured her wrist. The medical bills came to $4,200 and she was living on a pension of $1,800 a month. She couldn't afford the treatment, using emergency room charity care, trying to figure out how she'd pay for follow-up appointments. Victoria Thornton got out of her Mercedes, clearly intoxicated, and the first words out of her mouth were, "Get out of my way, I have diplomatic immunity." Not, "Is that woman okay?" Not, "I'm so sorry, is she hurt?" Just, "I have diplomatic immunity," like that was some magic phrase that made drunk driving and nearly killing an elderly woman disappear. I got to court early that Tuesday morning, like I always do. My father taught me, "Frank, if you're not 10 minutes early, you're late." Going through my docket with Christina's strong Italian coffee, I noticed a diplomatic notation on Victoria's file immediately. State Department involvement flagged. Documentation that her father had already called the courthouse trying to pressure people. US Marshals were present, which told me this had federal interest. And sitting in the front row, wearing a worn cardigan with her right wrist in a cast, was Mrs. Eleanor Hayes. She looked nervous, like maybe she was causing trouble by pressing charges against an ambassador's daughter. Then Victoria Thornton arrived, 20 minutes late, stepping out of a chauffeur-driven car like she was arriving at a fashion show. Designer outfit, sunglasses indoors on a grey March morning, Louis Vuitton bag that probably cost more than Mrs. Hayes' monthly pension. She walked into my courtroom like she was on a runway, phone out, texting, zero acknowledgement of Mrs. Hayes sitting right there in the front row. She brought an embassy attorney named James Whitmore, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Mrs. Hayes in her worn cardigan, sitting quietly with her fractured wrist. Victoria, in clothes worth thousands, acting like this courtroom was an inconvenience interrupting her important life. What bothered me wasn't the expensive clothes or the late arrival or even the attitude. It was the complete lack of awareness that she'd hurt someone. Mrs. Hayes was sitting right there, injured, struggling financially because of Victoria's reckless choices, and this girl couldn't even look at her. Money can buy a lot of things, but it can't buy basic human decency, and Victoria Thornton was about to learn that lesson the hard way. If you believe diplomatic privilege shouldn't mean immunity from basic human decency, subscribe to Judge Caprio Files right now. We share real courtroom moments where entitled defendants learn that no passport protects you from justice. Have you ever witnessed someone use their family's position or power to escape accountability for hurting others? Drop your story below. These experiences need to be heard because they remind us why we have to keep fighting for equal justice every single day. Christina called the case at exactly 9 o'clock. Victoria Thornton, reckless driving, DUI and assault. Before Christina could even finish reading the charges, Victoria interrupted from her seat. "It's alleged reckless driving. Please get it right." The disrespect was immediate, and intentional. I asked her to approach the bench and she stayed seated examining her manicured nails. "I'll stand when my attorney tells me it's legally necessary," she said. Her attorney tried to manage her, leaning over to whisper something, but she waved him off like he was a servant. "I've got this, James," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Miss Thornton, do you understand the charges against you?" She pulled out her diplomatic passport and waved it at me like a hall pass from high school. "I understand that I have diplomatic immunity and this is a waste of everyone's time." I explained patiently that her father, as a serving ambassador, has diplomatic immunity, but she, as an adult family member, has limited immunity that doesn't cover criminal acts on US soil. "That's not what Daddy's lawyer said," she replied, then looked directly at Mrs. Hayes for the first time and said, "Besides, nothing actually happened to anyone." Mrs. Hayes was sitting right there with her wrist in a cast, medical bill she couldn't afford, probably in pain, and this girl said nothing happened? The prosecutor called Mrs. Hayes to testify. I watched this elderly woman walk slowly to the witness stand, struggling with her injured wrist. Her voice was shaking. I was crossing at the marked crosswalk. The sign came crashing down. I fell trying to get away. My wrist... That's when Victoria audibly sighed and rolled her eyes. Mrs. Hayes kept explaining how terrifying it was, how she'd fractured her wrist, how she worried about the medical costs. Victoria turned to her attorney loud enough for everyone to hear. "Is this almost over? I have a spa appointment at noon." A spa appointment, while a woman she'd nearly killed was testifying about her injuries. I gave Victoria a chance to show some remorse. Anything indicating she understood what she'd done. She stood, looked Mrs. Hayes up and down with pure contempt and said, "Your Honour, I don't know why we're treating this like a tragedy. She's fine. A little bruise maybe. These things happen." Mrs. Hayes said quietly, "My wrist is broken, dear." Victoria's face twisted with disgust. "Don't call me dear. You're not my grandmother." Then she said something I'll never forget. "Your Honour, she's just a nobody, a retired teacher living in some tiny apartment. My father contributes more to this city's economy in one dinner than she earned in her entire career." The courtroom went dead silent. An elderly veteran in the back row stood up and said, "You should be ashamed." Victoria turned to him and said, "Sit down, old man. This doesn't concern you." Mrs. Hayes started crying. Not loud dramatic crying, just quiet tears running down her face while she tried to maintain her dignity. The law students were staring in horror. Christina stopped typing and just stared. I felt that combination of anger and sadness when you realise you're watching someone who has completely lost touch with basic human decency. "Miss Thornton, you just called a woman who dedicated 42 years to educating children a nobody." She doubled down. "I'm just being honest, Judge. She probably made minimum wage teaching. I spend more on shoes." She actually lifted her foot to show me her Louboutin heel. "These cost $1,200. That's probably her monthly rent." Mrs. Hayes was looking at the floor now, humiliated. I told Victoria she was dangerously close to contempt of court. And she laughed. "Contempt for telling the truth? Judge, let me explain how the world works." She approached my bench without permission, ignoring her attorney's desperate attempts to stop her. "My father is a US ambassador. We live in embassy residences. We dine with heads of state." Then she pointed at Mrs. Hayes. "She lives in what? A rent-controlled apartment? She volunteers at a library because she's bored and poor? I shouldn't even be in the same room as her." I stood up from my bench, something I rarely do, and told her to sit down immediately. This entitled 26-year-old looked me right in the eye and said, "Make me." This is exactly why you need to subscribe to Judge Caprio Files. We show what happens when judges refuse to let privilege become immunity. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss these moments of real justice. Victoria started pacing around my courtroom like she owned the place. "I'm done with this charade," she said, voice getting louder. She turned to Mrs. Hayes and said, "Lady, I'm sorry your life turned out so pathetic, but that's not my fault. You chose to be a teacher. You chose poverty. I chose excellence. We are not the same." I told Victoria to stop talking. Why? Because the truth hurts. Because you don't want to hear that some people matter more than others. That's how the world actually works. Then she pulled out her phone in the middle of proceedings and started dialing. "Miss Thornton, you cannot make phone calls during court." She held up one finger. "1 second, Judge. Adults are talking. Daddy? Yes, I'm still in this ridiculous court. The judge is being difficult. Can you call the State Department? I could faintly hear her father telling her to hang up. Daddy, you always fix things. Fix this. She hung up with a triumphant smile. That should resolve this shortly. That's when James Whitmore stood up, looking deeply uncomfortable. Your Honour, may I approach? At the bench, his voice was shaking. Judge, I was retained by Ambassador Thornton, not Miss Thornton personally. I've been instructed to invoke diplomatic immunity regardless of the legal facts, but I cannot in good conscience continue. He pulled out a folder, 3 prior incidents. A hit and run in Paris in 2021, an assault in London in 2022, a DUI in Geneva in 2023. All 3 dismissed due to diplomatic pressure. Each victim was working class. Each time, her father made it disappear with phone calls and money. Every single time, the victims were people Victoria saw as beneath her. And here she was again, same pattern, same entitled attitude, expecting the same result. This is a pattern of behaviour, Your Honour, Whitmore said quietly. I cannot ethically continue representing someone who shows no remorse and threatens elderly victims. I'm withdrawing. Victoria spun around. James, you're fired. You work for my father. Whitmore looked at her sadly. I work for justice, Miss Thornton. Something you've never understood. He walked out and Victoria looked genuinely shocked that someone had chosen principles over her father's money and influence. She completely lost control. Pattern of what? Living my life? Those people in Paris, London, Geneva, they were nobodies just like her. The world has important people and unimportant people, Judge. I'm important, they're not. My family moves economies, shapes policy, dines with presidents. What does she do? She reads to children for free because her pension is so pathetic she has nothing better to do. You want to play hardball? My father knows the governor. He golfs with your state senators. One phone call and you're reviewing parking tickets in a basement courthouse for the rest of your career. This teacher, this judge, all of you, you're all replaceable nobodies. We don't answer to municipal courts run by small-town judges. That's when Mrs. Hayes did something remarkable. This 68-year-old woman who'd been sitting quietly, crying, being verbally abused and humiliated, she stood up. Your Honour, may I say something? Of course, Mrs. Hayes. She turned to face Victoria, trembling but clear. Miss Thornton, I taught 3rd grade for 42 years. I taught over 1,200 children, doctors, lawyers, teachers, parents, good people from wealth and from poverty. Do you know what I taught them all? Victoria rolled her eyes. What? That everyone's special? Participation trophies for everybody? Mrs. Hayes didn't flinch. I taught them that character matters more than wealth, that kindness matters more than status, that how you treat people when they can't do anything for you reveals who you really are. And Miss Thornton, you are the saddest person I've met in 68 years. Not because you're cruel, but because you're empty. Victoria's face went bright red. How dare you psychoanalyze me, you pathetic old woman? She started walking toward Mrs. Hayes aggressively. You know what? I'm glad I almost hit you. Maybe next time I'll finish the job. The bailiff moved between them immediately, and I slammed my gavel so hard it echoed through the courtroom. If watching entitled bullies face real consequences makes you believe in justice again, subscribe to Judge Caprio Files right now. These are the stories that restore faith in accountability. Tell us in the comments, your voice matters. Miss Thornton, did you just threaten Mrs. Hayes with physical harm? I was speaking hypothetically, she said, voice shaking. You said maybe next time I'll finish the job. That's a direct threat against a witness in open court. Bailiff, please take Miss Thornton into custody for contempt of court and criminal threatening. What? You can't arrest me. I have diplomatic immunity. Miss Thornton, your father has diplomatic immunity. You, as his adult daughter, have limited immunity that does not cover criminal acts on US soil, and it especially doesn't cover threatening witnesses in my courtroom. My father will have you removed from the bench by tomorrow. Your father has no authority over state court judges. Officer Rodriguez approached with handcuffs. Don't you touch me! Do you know what happens to people who touch diplomats? Ma'am, Officer Rodriguez said patiently, you're not a diplomat. Please put your hands behind your back. She tried to run for the door, but the second bailiff blocked her. This is kidnapping. This is an international incident. My father will destroy all of you. As they handcuffed her, she kept yelling, "You're all nobodies. That old woman is nothing. I'm everything." We could hear her screaming down the hallway, even as the doors closed. Mrs. Hayes sat quietly, wiping her eyes. During recess, she approached my bench. "Your Honour, I don't want to cause international problems." "Mrs. Hayes, you haven't caused anything. Miss Thornton's behaviour caused this." An elderly veteran came over. "Judge, I served 30 years in the military. What that girl said about Mrs. Hayes, that's not what we fight for. Thank you for holding her accountable." During recess, I returned the State Department's call. "This is Deputy Secretary Morrison. We understand there's been an incident. She threatened an elderly victim in open court after calling her a nobody," I explained. "Judge, we've reviewed the incidents from Paris, London and Geneva. The State Department does not support misuse of diplomatic immunity. We will not interfere with your proceedings. And Judge, off the record, thank you for holding the line." 30 minutes later, Ambassador Thornton himself rushed in, looking genuinely embarrassed. "Your Honour, I apologise for my daughter's behaviour. I've shielded her from consequences for too long. I won't interfere with your ruling. She needs to face justice. My position was meant to serve my country," he said, "not protect my daughter from accountability for hurting people." 4 hours later, they brought Victoria back in an orange jumpsuit, handcuffed, makeup smeared, hair dishevelled. The arrogance was completely gone. She looked small and scared. "Miss Thornton, how do you plead?" "Guilty to all charges, Your Honour." She started crying. "For the DUI and reckless driving, 90 days in county jail, no work release, $5,000 fine, 3 years probation, 2-year licence suspension. For contempt of court, additional 30 days consecutive. For criminal threatening, mandatory anger management and 200 hours community service. General population, no special accommodations. And Miss Thornton, you will personally apologise to Mrs. Hayes right now." Victoria stood shaking, barely making eye contact. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm so sorry." She broke down completely. "I was cruel. I was horrible. You didn't deserve any of that. You're not a nobody. I am. I'm the nobody who doesn't understand basic human decency." Mrs. Hayes walked over and hugged her while she sobbed. "Child," she said softly, "I forgive you." The courtroom was silent, except for Victoria's crying. Even the bailiffs had tears in their eyes. Ambassador Thornton stood in the gallery. "I failed as a father," he said, voice breaking. "I gave my daughter privilege without teaching her responsibility. Thank you for doing what I should have done years ago." He turned to Mrs. Hayes. "Ma'am, all your medical bills will be paid, and I'm establishing a scholarship in your name. $50,000 annually for retired teachers who volunteer after retirement." "Ambassador, that's too much." "It's not nearly enough," he said, "to repair the damage we've caused." 4 months later, Victoria was released from jail. Mrs. Hayes was waiting outside to take her to her first day of community service at Hope Street Elementary. "After everything I said to you," Victoria whispered. "Hush now," Mrs. Hayes replied. "Everyone deserves a second chance to become who they're meant to be." 6 months after that, Victoria returned to my courtroom. "Your Honour, I've completed 600 hours now. I'm applying to graduate school for education. I want to become a teacher." "What changed, Miss Thornton?" "Your Honour, I spent 26 years thinking my worth came from my father's title. Then one little girl hugged me and said, 'Thank you for teaching me to read.' Nobody ever valued me for what I gave, only for who my father was. Mrs. Hayes taught me that being a nobody with a kind heart is better than being a somebody with an empty soul." 1 year later, Victoria and Mrs. Hayes share an apartment. Victoria is enrolled in her master's program for elementary education and works part-time at Hope Street Elementary. They created a reading program called Every Child is Somebody that now serves 15 schools across Providence. Ambassador Thornton resigned his position to return home and be the father Victoria needed. And the woman Victoria called just a nobody became the somebody who taught her what it means to be human. In 40 years on this bench, I've learnt that the most dangerous people aren't always the most violent. Sometimes they're the ones who've never been told no, never faced consequences, never learnt that every human being has infinite worth. The value of a life isn't measured in titles or wealth, but in lives touched, kindness shown, and love given. The real nobodies are people without compassion. I'm Frank Caprio. Remember, the best judgment isn't always in the book. Sometimes it's in giving someone the chance to discover their humanity. Thanks for listening, and God bless.